Welcome to the Leobeck Institute. I am Frank Mecklenburg, the senior historian at LBI, and I welcome you to this presentation. But let me just say beforehand, Leobeck Institute, Library and Archive for the History and Culture of German-Speaking Jews, and part of the Center for Jewish History. Our holdings are available on West 16th Street in Chelsea in New York, and online for worldwide access. LBI offers several scholarship programs, among them the David Baumgardt Memorial Fellowship, to assist scholars sharing in David Baumgardt's interests, including ethics, Wissenschaft des Judentums, and the modern intellectual history of German-speaking Jewry. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jason Yonover, the 2017 recipient of LBI's David Baumgardt Fellowship Award. He is also the most recent winner of the American Philosophical Association's triennial Baumgardt Memorial Fellowship, which is the occasion of this for this event. Dr. Yonover has a double PhD from Johns Hopkins University, his PhD in German Studies in spring of 2022, and his PhD in philosophy in the summer of 2022. He was a visiting researcher at Paris University 8, which is a public university, in 2022, and is now the Dese Family Postdoctoral Research Associate and Lecturer in Philosophy at Princeton University. He will talk to us today about the development of the idea that political process can only be achieved, progress can only be achieved through struggle, in starting out with the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza and following 18th century philosopher Salomon Maimon, to Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel in the 19th century, and his and their influence on Dr. Martin Luther King. Please take it from here. The podium is all yours, Dr. Yonover.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Mecklenburg. It's an immense pleasure to see you today, to see everyone today, to be back here at the Leobeck Institute for the study of German Jewish history and culture. I had the great opportunity to pursue some of my work as a PhD student here several years ago, as Frank mentioned. And while I made that visit in the context of other research projects, this is a particularly meaningful venue for me to share my more recent work today, not just because of its proximity to Bread's Bakery down the street, where I picked up some chocolate rugelach that is in the back of the room, in case anybody's interested. This is not a paid endorsement, but it's particularly meaningful to be here also for two other main reasons. First, my focus in this presentation is not on the civil rights movement per se, but given that I'll be exploring King's thought, I emphasize that there are numerous important collections here at LBI from which one can learn a great deal about German Jewish leaders' involvement in the relevant events. I highlight, for instance, two figures on this slide, Rabbis Walter Plaut and Joachim Prinz. Both had fled Nazi Germany and saw important parallels between what was happening there and then what they found in the US. Rabbi Prinz even spoke, for instance, at the March on Washington itself, after gospel singer Mahalia Jackson and prior to King, from that very difficult position in the schedule for that day. Prince offered a great joke that should not go unmentioned. Before beginning his speech in the expected German accent as a German Jew in exile, Prince namely told the massive audience of tens of thousands of people, "I wish I could sing." LBI has done the hard work of digitizing a great deal of material here, so I encourage everyone to search their site and to learn more about these really interesting figures. A second reason I'm especially excited to share this work at LBI today is that this occasion marks an award I had received more recently, as Frank mentioned, not from LBI, but from the American Philosophical Association. That award was endowed by David Baumgardt, whose papers are faithfully maintained here. Baumgardt was a scholar and a philosopher who likewise fled the Nazi regime. And as far as his research was concerned, he had, like me, a particular interest in the dialogues between apparently distinct traditions. Especially, he was especially interested in the legacy of the Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza in German language thought. And as I'll stress in conclusion, he also took up some of the insights that were available in Spinoza's thought in some of the German and German Jewish philosophers who were inspired by Spinoza, who I'll be talking about today. So there are several connections here to him. And to give you a sense of those connections broadly and where I'm headed, this slide might help summarize. I'm going to try to tell a highly non-standard, but I think well-documented story concerning the idea that progress only comes through struggle. In brief, the story is that Spinoza's and then Salomon Maimon's realist politics can help clarify Hegel's thinking on this front, which King then, to my mind, is going to very interestingly challenge. By the way, by realism today, when I reference Spinoza's realist politics, I mean an anti-utopian stress on power in politics. And if that sounds abstract, that's okay. It should become clear soon what's at stake precisely. I'm going to proceed in chronological order to clarify the philosophical dialogues here. But before I get to any philosophical arguments, I'm going to turn to a paper trail of sorts in reverse chronological order that would motivate my thematic focus here. It demands some motivation. This is not a standard collection of thinkers here. And to that end, we got to travel from LBI to the Gottlieb Archival Research Center at Boston University, which maintains an extensive King collection totaling over 80,000 items, including King's briefcase on the right hand of this slide. There's a lot to see, but I'm going to begin with one particularly fascinating letter that remains unpublished, that has not yet been discussed in the literature. It was sent to King in 1957, and it reads roughly, Dr. King, it was nice to cross paths recently. I just came across this text, and what's the deal? I quote about 1/3 of the way into this letter. The sender writes, I'm puzzled by the enclosed clipping. You and I have Jesus Christ as our way, truth, and life. Since he was the Son of God who made this world in us, he gives us all the guidance that we need. Why did the reporter quote you as following Hegel rather than Jesus? And then again, towards the end of the letter, it's reiterated, why Hegel rather than Jesus? The sender here is Father Cornelius J. Drew, who was, according to the New York Times' obituary from '62, another civic, obviously religious leader. He was head of St. Charles Borromeo Church in Harlem. King apparently did not respond to his letter, although he seems to have been interested in it, and the suggestion that his reference point should be Christianity, full stop, as we might more likely think King to have. If you look up at the top of the letter, you'll see that this letter was marked for filing. And if you look up into the right, you'll see that it was indeed filed, proving King's receipt of it, his interest in it. Furthermore, that text file indeed should be in King's hand. You can compare the I and the L followed by a vowel on the right-hand side here from another text, as King writes the very important word, philosophy. In any case, while King certainly seems to have received it, we don't know what he thought about it, nor do we as yet know anything about its inspiration. Where is this coming from? Why all of a sudden would the sender think that King is some kind of Hegelian? Why would he be following this obscure German philosopher who's mostly the focus today of academic scholarship? Unfortunately, the enclosed clipping is no longer enclosed. King could have said something about Hegel to a wide range of reporters. As his worn briefcase from the earlier slide would indicate, King was very busy already. By 57, he was increasingly reaching a national audience. But we do have an interview from the year prior where King speaks to a local newspaper in Montgomery here in 56. This is published in the weeks after Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat when King was starting to lead the bus boycott that followed. This interview is interesting for several reasons, therefore, given its occasion. But in particular, you'll notice the right column carries a section title noting that King, I quote, admires Hegel's philosophy. And if we zoom in there, despite the image resolution, we can hopefully see more specifically what the interviewer gathered from speaking to King, namely that King was interested in Hegel's notion of dialectic, or as it's reasonably glossed here, I quote, the strife of opposites. The reporter goes on to cite a discussion of this notion in Hegel by Will Durant, who had published a popular account of the history of philosophy that King would use as well, and who writes in connection with Hegel, according to the newspaper's text, struggle is the law of growth. And if we take a look at Durant's actual text, on the right-hand side of the slide now, things get even more interesting. Durant writes in this text the story of philosophy that was first printed in 1926, and that was republished many times. He writes, I quote, Hegel's philosophy of history seems to lead to revolutionary conclusions. The dialectical process makes change the cardinal principle of life. In every stage of things, there is a contradiction which only the strife of opposites can resolve. The deepest law of politics, therefore, is freedom, an open avenue to change. Anyone in the audience who has read Hegel knows not only that reading Hegel itself can be a struggle, but also that the idea of struggle and even contradiction as productive is all over his writings. I'm going to look at some of the details here later on, where we'll also see that King really knows these details. He's not just reading this popular treatment by Durant. But meanwhile, it should already be clear, Hegel is here associated with a certain radical philosophical tendency, and this will surprise some folks today. Hegel's colonialist account of the African continent as a land without history is very rightly emphasized in recent discussion. And over the past 2 centuries, a typical line taken associates Hegel generally with a reactionary tendency to consider his historical moment as the greatest one possible. Huey Newton, who was much more impressed by the German philosopher Nietzsche, it happens, will, for instance, write of, I quote, Hegel's attempt to hold the status quo together in likewise unpublished writings for his PhD. And speaking more generally, the recent rehabilitation of Hegel in Anglophone philosophy has often taken place by way of an alignment with Kant, who himself associates law or right with freedom, like Hegel to some degree, but who, unlike Hegel, strictly denies us what Durant calls an open avenue to change, any kind of right of revolution. Of course, I won't have time to give you anything like an interpretation of Kant today, but suffice it to say that despite his Enlightenment ideals of human progress, for instance, in the top passage here, where Kant imagines a future in which man's destiny can be fulfilled, despite that, Kant explicitly rejects on numerous occasions the right to any deep political contestation. For instance, writing very clearly in the bottom passage here that, I quote, there can be no rightful resistance on the part of the people. It's the duty of the people to tolerate even what is apparently the most intolerable misuse of supreme power. In short, Kant's categorical thinking rejects the possibility of rightful rebellion for its potential to undermine any social order. Today, Kantians will try to work their way out of this view. I've tried to argue with them, but it's worth noting that some decades ago also, Adolf Eichmann had in contrast tried to embrace this kind of thinking at his trial. He claimed he was merely passive, could not neglect his alleged duties, and he referenced Kant there. Given this circumstance, anyone pursuing a contextualized interpretation of Hegel as suggesting any kind of revolutionary conclusions, per Durant, is going to have to look elsewhere for antecedents to Hegel's views here. And on my interpretation, Hegel is actually best seen as following up on his other main influence, not Kant, but then Spinoza. The parallel between Hegel and Spinoza is one that I've worked on a lot. There's a lot to say about it. Hegel made the far-reaching claim, among other things, that, I quote, you are either a Spinozist or not a philosopher at all. And he returns to Spinoza on many occasions too in his writings. But my contribution in recent discussions on this front has been to show that Hegel can be understood to be in dialogue with Spinoza's political thought specifically, and on the basis of several neglected historical circumstances. For instance, that Hegel had worked in detail on what might be called the first critical edition, the first kind of scholarly edition of Spinoza's writings. It's there on the left-hand side of the slide. This edition of Spinoza was organized at the beginning of Hegel's career in 1803 with his assistance on some details regarding Spinoza's primary work in political philosophy, specifically the theological political treatise. And so in an introduction to the edition, you can see this expression of gratitude to Hegel in the original Latin on the right-hand side of the slide. Keeping in mind then that Hegel clearly knows well Spinoza's political thought prior to any of his work in this area, and keeping in mind the apparent but forgotten importance of Hegel to King, let's briefly turn now to Spinoza, particularly his account of political change, and finally now the first major section, the first more philosophical section of this presentation. In this section, I'm going to try to quickly gloss Spinoza's radically realist account of political right, the consequences of this account for his stance on rebellion, and the influence that it seems to have had on the German Jewish thinker Salomon Maimon, who offers another link in this story that I'm trying to tell that can hopefully tighten it up. The basis of Spinoza's political thought is that right tags along with power, so to speak. At the outset of his key chapter on politics in the Theological Political Treatise of 1670, Spinoza then namely clarifies that right and power are virtually identical. He writes, for example, fish are determined by nature to swim and big fish to eat little ones, and therefore it is by sovereign natural right that fish have possession of the water and that big fish eat small fish. For it is certain that nature, considered wholly in itself, has a sovereign right to do everything that it can do. That is, the right of nature extends as far as its power extends. In short, Spinoza is arguing here from his view that there's nothing but nature, to the conclusion that everything does what it does rightfully, or as it's sometimes glossed, that might makes right. While you might find this view disconcerting, I think it can be made intuitive, at least, if we take Spinoza's thought seriously that there's nothing but nature. There's no special kind of human domain that plays by its own rules within the larger domain of nature, where we have maybe 1 foot in or 1 foot out as well. So think, just as we normally wouldn't accuse one non-human animal of doing something unrightful to another in the so-called wild, Spinoza will refrain from this in the case of human animals too. But even if you're on board with that line of thinking, you're hopefully wondering what could possibly be revolutionary about this account of right. Spinoza might seem like the ultimate anti-revolutionary. How could this help us understand potentially revolutionary tendencies in Hegel that King is then apparently so interested in? The trick is, if we take seriously this principle that might makes right, we also have to take seriously the right of whoever triumphs. Insofar as the revolutionary then takes power, they also take right, and Spinoza is going to admit this, though this is often missed in recent scholarship on Spinoza. He therefore specifies carefully that, I quote, a subject is said to have committed a crime like revolution, for instance, if he has tried in any way to seize the right of the supreme power or to transfer it to another. I say has tried, for if they were not to be condemned until after the deed had been committed, for the most part the state would try this too late, after its right had been seized or transferred to another. In other words, if some sovereign aims to defeat the rebel after the revolution has already taken place, this now previous sovereign would be doing so too late. Spinoza's realist notion of right that's just strictly grounded in power, I think leads straightforwardly to this result. I think it's one of the many cases illustrating the elegance of his political philosophy that I've argued flows kind of out of this realist account of right. With this account of Spinoza's realist views here, I turn to the next step in the story, the second portion of this section of the presentation now on Salomon Maimon. Maimon is best known among philosophers today for his engagement with Kant. Kant thought Salomon Maimon was his best critic. Maimon is known more broadly, otherwise, especially for his philosophical autobiography, recently re-edited and retranslated, by the way, there on your right on the slide. Maimon wrote this text, this autobiography, after arriving to German-speaking territories in the late 18th century, so we're now about a century after Spinoza would have died. And this autobiography about his travels through Eastern Europe and more became a major reference in the period and also beyond. It's now one of the most key texts in German Jewish culture, not least because it was the first modern Jewish autobiographical work per se, but also because it was written in German specifically, so it was especially influential for a wide range of specifically German Jewish figures, like more recently Hannah Arendt, for instance, who will discuss it in interesting ways. Indeed, non-Jewish Germans also appreciated Maimon's philosophical autobiography for its insights into Jewish culture and specifically philosophy. By these means, Maimon becomes this influential reader of Spinoza, whom he discusses on numerous occasions in that text and elsewhere. Eventually, he's also kicked out of certain Jewish communities for his provocative philosophical tendencies, which include some doctrines of Spinozism. But what does this mean for us today? I suggest that some of the challenge of Spinoza's political realism is brought into German language philosophical discourse this way too, not just directly from Spinoza, for instance, to Hegel, but also via Salomon Maimon, it seems. For instance, in passages in Maimon's corpus like these on the slide. At the top of the slide, you can see here the opening of Maimon's autobiography. It gets started, right away with these kind of political reflections, which embody a critical perspective on alleged rights that are not backed up by power. So rights that are really not even rightly called rights. Maimon is here trying to communicate to the reader the political situation of various classes in the Polish Commonwealth, for instance, the Jews, and he cites the example of a population in extreme poverty such that they can't, as he puts it, act on some rights that they would supposedly have. Maimon is implying here that the sense in which they have these rights is then very weak if we can speak of them having rights at all, precisely because right is not aligned with power in this case. And for a right to be taken seriously, it has to be aligned with power. Similarly, Maimon will stress in other texts that right and power have to be aligned. In a more immediately political philosophical essay, for instance, that I translated a couple of years ago, where he's discussing a sort of natural state in which then whoever maintains power over a thing, in this case, maintains right over that thing. But he notices, just like Spinoza, if power tags along with right, and if someone who was previously without power then gathers power, they also then gather right. That's what Maimon means when he says that in that certain natural state, superiority merely decides for the current use of something. To be clear, Maimon's then going to argue that because this is necessarily going to be a kind of chaos, a struggling back and forth, we should attempt a more secure political system. But it's interesting that he goes there, he kind of issues this pressure from this conception of natural right. It's Hegel who's going to explore the possibility that we could get to a more stable system of right, where right and power are aligned more seriously. Maimon doesn't quite get there. He had other plans that he didn't get to. He died early. And interestingly, Hegel held both of these texts that I'm citing on this slide in his library. Scholars today have shown that Hegel gathered at least some aspects of his understanding of Spinoza specifically from Maimon. So again, this German Jewish thinker, this key figure in the German Jewish tradition, seems to be transmitting knowledge about the Jewish philosopher Spinoza into then German language philosophy, where Spinoza had been a major reference in the period, where he's becoming an increasingly major reference, and where there are then, I think, some really interesting results. So let's turn now to Hegel again and look at some of these results. Hegel, again, does not fully embrace Spinoza's radical realism, just like Maimon. Maimon takes it as a kind of challenge, as I think Hegel will too, also following Hegel's editorial work on Spinoza's political philosophy that I mentioned. This is all going to take Hegel away, though, from Kant's rejection of a right of revolution towards this more open stance. So again, we've got this kind of thing that needs to be explained. How does Hegel end up in this more supposedly revolutionary stance, given that in the German philosophical tradition, you've got this Kantian position, no revolution allowed. To understand how that could be possible, we have to begin by laying some more complicated groundwork in Hegel's philosophy of history. Hegel thinks that history is about the course of what he calls world spirit, but as strange as this might sound, it doesn't have to be anything too esoteric, I think. Hegel is relatively down to earth in supposing that, I quote, spirit, Geist in Hegel's German, we could also translate this key term as mind, it's only what it does. So history is about the course of this entity spirit and its spirit, whatever it does. Furthermore, its doing is just our doing, but to understand in what sense that's the case, I think we have to say more about what I'll call Hegel's teleological picture. That's a technical term that I don't want to avoid in this case. It's one that King would have faced as well. So what does it mean for a conception of history to be teleological, with this term, of course, coming from the Greek for end, namely telos? King audited a seminar that was very important for him on the philosophy of history. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you have an excerpt from his lecture notes there that we can use. The teleological conception of history would namely be one according to which, I quote, there's an end or goal toward which everything is striving in history. More specifically, Hegel thinks spirit or mind is essentially free, and it comes to know itself as such. The idea is basically humans are these rational, free beings at their core. They embody spirit, and history is then about recognizing and doing justice to the fact that humans are these rational, free beings at their core to an increasingly greater degree. According to Hegel, the development of human freedom is pushed along by actions of world historical importance that correspond to particular principles consecutively. I quote, again, the states, nations, and individuals involved in this business of the world spirit emerge with their own particular and determinate principle in each case, and they carry it out. So such principles are decisive as long as they lead. Hegel even thinks that the presently world historical nation is truly, quote, dominant, such that the spirits of other nations are without right. In a sense, this all shows how committed Hegel is to what he considers to be this progressive development in human history, but even at very serious costs. So how do these nations Hegel's talking about first reach their principle, and what's at stake here? This is where Hegel's world historical individuals come in. They act in the most robust sense for him. I quote from the top left side of the slide. At the forefront of all actions, including world historical actions, are individuals who are the living expressions of the substantial deed of this world spirit and are thus immediately identical with it. So these world historical individuals, in Hegel's terminology, they bring about what has to come. But importantly, the way that they do that is going to involve acting contrary to some world historical moment and its principle, because these proceed consecutively. And the necessity of this violation is a major concern within Hegel's framework, because for him, what's right and good is normally tied to one's context. Despite this grand account of progress in history, Hegel also argues that, I quote, duty is rooted in the soil of civil life, or in other words, what you should do is heavily context dependent. We should fit into our roles, for instance, and it's in fitting into our roles in society, Hegel thinks, that we become free. It's not by doing whatever we want. It's not any kind of caprice, which is a notion of freedom that Hegel criticizes very strongly. It's precisely in accepting responsibilities, accepting duties, that we become free. I'll return to attention here between these two strands and Hegel's thought in a minute, but if you glance to the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see again King discussing this Hegelian account of an allegedly proper or even free social existence in duty. King writes, now reconstructing Hegel, I quote, the will is free if insofar as it wills the universal. And Hegel, King then continues with a less technical glossary on Hegel. That is to say, if it acts in accordance with right, with the law, the will, this individual willing, is then free. This is from one of the 4 extant and unpublished short papers that King wrote directly on Hegel. And I shared, among other things, to emphasize that in getting into the weeds briefly with Hegel here, we're definitely not departing from where we started, where we'll end up with King. This paper by King is on Hegel's technical notion of objective spirit. Remember, we've already seen this notion of spirit a couple times. Objective spirit means here specifically the way it references especially the objectification, the kind of institutionalization of humanity in institutions, in bureaucracy, and these kinds of things, of which Hegel is actually very fond as he tries to argue for this broader welfare state, as I think we can roughly gloss it. But good. Let's now try to return to that tension in Hegel's philosophy of history, namely this one: if living properly and even freely means conforming to one's context, then what should we make of these world historical individuals who act contrary to the current order and its principles? So what if one of these individuals comes along and rejects their context, in anticipating, though, this supposedly rightful arrival of a higher principle that's got to arrive according to Hegel? Hegel's weaving these 2 strands of his ethical thought together is no simple matter, but it's here, I think, that a right of progressive revolutionary action, specifically in clashes, appears. So we got to clarify that. In one respect, history moves forward. The means by which it does so are absolutely right, but in another respect, what's right is constantly determined by the historical moment. So breaking off from some order is going to mean betrayal. It's going to mean conflict. The solution, I think, is this. Hegel's going to end up arguing that while any given social order indeed has its right to exist, it's a limited right, and world history and its absolute right are going to stand above all. So while laying out these various spheres of right in relation to one another, then Hegel is going to write, I quote again, "Only the right of world spirit is absolute in an unlimited sense. World history, the progressive actualization of freedom as we've lost it, can thus involve superseding a whole host of things." Hegel doesn't shy away from listing them, to his credit. I quote at the bottom of the slide here: justice, virtue, wrongdoing, and I want to highlight especially violence. These things are all on what Hegel's going to call the slaughter bench of world history. They can be dismissed. Worries about them can be set aside when it comes to this necessary progression in world history. Hegel is going to expand on this point in lectures when he claims that there are times for, I quote, "preserving the individual nation or state and the ordered departments of its life." And then there are times when, I quote again, "world history and the world spirit may continue in their course." In other words, when disturbance is needed, disturbance is justified. And in short, because there's this true conflict of claims of right with world history and the world historical individual's highest right to further the cause of freedom up against the right of the existing ethical order, because of that, this world historical individual, or also nation, is really going to have to disturb. But for Hegel, the disturbance is absolutely rightful, absolutely necessary, insofar as a successful and new order is going to be instituted, where I think we can sense that he's following some of Hegel's realism. Insofar as this new order is instituted, it has its right. You can't just be a kind of moral agent who makes a claim for some utopia. You have to really make it happen. And you have to have your right accompanied by power then. And Hegel's going to take this kind of thinking to some dark places, as you've already seen here. I think we can finally best identify both a brutal colonialist strain in Hegel's thought, as well as a progressive liberatory one. Regarding first the brutal colonialist strain here in Hegel, I summarize that on Hegel's view, peoples can disrupt other peoples if this can be made sense of in terms of world historical progress. King seems to have been aware of this issue in Hegel. I cite here another unpublished essay in his archives, which reads roughly, "There's something both progressive and reactionary to Hegel," basically. I'm going to leave Kant aside for now. The paper says Hegel had forfeited this orthodox notion of natural law as an ideal standard in favor of the view that positive law ought to be, because it in fact is. So you can't have some kind of extra mundane moral standards and impose those upon some given social order. That social order is going to have some kind of right itself. But King continues, this latter argument is unfortunately going to color Hegel's treatment of international relations. Additionally, the supposedly more advanced state is limited by no morality when it meets an obstacle in allegedly more primitive state. So remember now that brutal progression that Hegel has envisioned. Basically, this paper, King's paper here, is arguing that there's a serious cost to this formulation of advance of consciousness of freedom on Hegel's account, which we've been considering in this section of the presentation. As we've seen, like Spinoza, plausibly following Maimon's related realism, but against Kant, Hegel's argued that the successful revolutionary is also the rightful revolutionary. He's arrived there by aligning right and power to a greater degree than Kant would have allowed, like Maimon had also done, like Spinoza had done more radically. But to be precise, Hegel's also argued against Spinoza, and he's really on Kant's side here, that there's an important teleological component to history. We didn't get to look at that in Spinoza, but Spinoza doesn't think that history is, tending in some kind of direction where it's got some kind of goal. He doesn't think that it makes sense to think of nature as having any goals whatsoever, in fact. But because Hegel's on Kant's side there with this kind of Enlightenment optimism regarding the possibilities that lie in the human being, for Hegel, the success of the revolutionary is going to have to consist not only in taking power, that's a very serious component, obviously, of these developments in Hegel, but it's going to have to consist also in instituting this higher ethical order, developing this course of world history as he sees it, bringing humans closer to what Kant had called their free destiny. The problem is that anyone partial to Hegel's views here, like King, obviously now we know, is going to wonder if it's possible to avoid the brutality Hegel envisions to be endemic to historical progress. Hegel thought, for instance, that the colonial adventures of various European states in the modern period were opportunities to make progress in world history. Is there any way to make room for progress in this vein without also making room for these kind of adventures, given, among other things, the extreme unfreedom that they carry with them? I think that question is worth considering, especially in the context of King, not least because we know now he's partial to what some of Hegel has argued, but also because he's deeply inspired by the anti-colonial movements of his day. Furthermore, I think there's pressure on Hegel on his own terms, because he readily acknowledges that one can't be free if one isn't alive and well. Interestingly, this commitment is going to motivate important welfare rights in Hegel, which I can't get to right now. But since Hegel argues that one has to be alive and well in order to be free, we might very reasonably wonder, could Hegel be shooting even himself in the foot in licensing this violence, this exploitation under the auspices of alleged freedom? So maybe we should think more about which cases Hegel should really consider cases of ascension to a higher ethical order with the help of the world historical individual. Maybe we should think more about the means by which this ascension can obtain, even on his terms. And the upshot of my paper now at this point, as I try to bring some of these threads together, is that King can help us do that. King can help Hegel do that. So I finally turn now to King a bit more directly within the final section of this presentation. It should, again, be clear that King's engagement with Hegel goes well beyond his exposure to that popularized account in Durant, which was referenced in that Montgomery advertiser profile of King that's really been forgotten. Indeed, as you see here on the right, King took a number of courses in philosophy generally in the context of his graduate work in systematic theology at Boston University. This is his coursework from fall 51 to spring 53. As he clarifies in the text on the left, I quote, "During my doctoral studies, I studied philosophy and theology at Boston University under these two characters. They both greatly stimulated, or in an earlier manuscript version of this text that I found here, this is at the bottom of the slide, he wrote, deeply influenced, not just greatly stimulated, my thinking. Just before Breitman's death, I began studying the philosophy of Hegel with him, although the course was mainly a study of Hegel's monumental work, Phenomenology of Mind. I spent my spare time reading his philosophy of history and his philosophy of right, which are the two texts I've been relying on in this presentation, in the second section of this presentation. First of all, I think we have to appreciate in this passage from King, this autobiographical reflection, the line about spare time, because Hegel's Phenomenology is one of the few most difficult works in the history of European philosophy. Reading other primary texts by Hegel while trying to work through that one for the first time is very ambitious, to say the least. It's certainly not how I began studying Hegel, overwhelmed as I was. But additionally, if you look back to the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see this was not even just a one semester, but rather a full year, 2-semester course that I've underlined in the reconstructed transcript where it's listed as seminar in philosophy. That's what King is referring to when he said he started to study Hegel with Brightman, who was thoroughly engaged with the German philosophical tradition and who had been one of the main attractions for King in coming to BU. But Brightman fell ill at the start of this Hegel seminar, so his colleague Peter Bertocci took over. He's officially listed as the instructor for the second semester, but it's the same course. And even though that's sometimes been noted within very highly limited secondary literature here on King and Hegel, what hasn't been emphasized in these very few discussions that exist is that King was also learning about Hegel in numerous other courses as well, as is clear from some of the other materials I've been citing in the previous section of the presentation. I was citing not only some of his papers for this course, but some of his notes for other courses, for instance, on the philosophy of history. Hegel would have also been a subject of discussion in the courses that dealt more directly with theology. But what's finally missed, most importantly, I think, is that King has a vital philosophical point to make against Hegel. So this is not just a one-way street of influence where Hegel is influencing King, but rather a two-way street of dialogue, or really it's even a kind of complex four-way intersection I'm proposing, where Spinoza, also Maimon, Hegel, and now King are meeting at this crossroads. So it's clear that we have to look at Hegel in the context of King, as we've already seen. Indeed, Father Drew had written to King, why Hegel, and hopefully I've given you an answer to that question. But I think we can also go to Hegel now and say, why King? Does King have something to say back to Hegel? And I think so. I think we can understand King as having to say something back to Hegel. Recall that there are these major demands to try to meet if King or anyone else, for that matter, certainly a range of figures in the Black radical tradition who repeatedly engage Hegel, but who I'm not able to discuss today, for instance, Frantz Fanon, Angela Davis, and there's a long list here. If any of them are going to try to hang on to at least some aspects of Hegel's ethical thought, they are going to want to say, I think, something about Hegel's licensing violent international domination and similar. First of all, to the end of seeing what King might have to say there, improving upon this brutal Hegelian account, but also without ending up in any kind of optimistic pacifism, without getting rid of some of the teleological, progressive, world historical strands in Hegel. Let me stress first, that King agrees with at least two key aspects of Hegel's philosophy of history as we've outlined it. The first is the teleological commitment. This line is going to be familiar, I think, to everyone. I quote King at the top of the slide. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. As for Hegel, for King, there's meaning in history. It's going to tend in a certain direction, and that direction is going to be a kind of ethical triumph specifically. But the second major aspect of Hegel's philosophy of history that King agrees with, this might be at least a little bit more surprising, is that history is nonetheless about clashes. It's no simple matter to get this ethical triumph. I quote again King from notes in advance of a talk on the philosophy of nonviolence. He says, "The history of mankind is replete with innumerable conflict situations." In other words, history does have this positive upshot, but it's a challenge. The second commitment could be found in the background of the first one, depending on how you read it. You might think the history of the moral universe is namely long. The arc of the moral universe is long because it swings, there are failures, humanity can maybe learn from those and make progress. But it depends, yeah, on how you read that first text. In any case, it's clear that you've got these two components that are also in Hegel, where King is going to part ways with Hegel, though, is in his emphasis on non-violence. That emphasis, by the way, that he shared with some of those Jewish leaders engaged in the civil rights struggle, who I mentioned initially. Where Hegel thought that the progress of world history meant permitting violations of virtually any kind. Remember this emphasized passage here at the bottom of the slide, where whatever needs to be on the slaughter bench is on the slaughter bench. King thinks instead, I quote, that moral ends can only be achieved by moral means. The means must be as pure as the end. King sees many advantages in this approach to ascending to higher ethical orders. These are not my focus, but for instance, King thinks that nonviolent protest importantly makes room for a wide range of people to join attractive political movements, which he thinks is necessary to their progress. King, interestingly, can be seen as democratizing Hegel's account of world history and the world historical individual then, but mostly set aside that kind of line of thinking for now. My focus is really on where King can be seen as improving upon this brutal teleological picture in Hegel, according to which history only moves forward in these violent fits and starts. A picture that Hegel had arrived at, I think, with some of the realism in hand anticipated by Spinoza and also Maimon, who had insight into the fact that right without power is nothing. Especially, again, when Hegel is all about freedom, when humans can't be free unless they're alive and well, then perhaps it could be possible for history to move forward, assuming, again, that it does with King and Hegel, without the agents of progressive change engaging in any kind of brutality themselves. Remember this paper in which King references, quote, Hegel's treatment of international relations, what we might just call Hegel's condoning, even encouraging colonialism and imperialism, Hegel's acceptance of exploitation in history, or also the present, what King elsewhere called, quote, the brutal logic of events, has long been familiar to a wide range of readers, not just King. R.D. Soren Kierkegaard had deep concerns about what he called the teleological suspension of the ethical in Hegel. Closer to King's context, another figure in the Black radical tradition, Amir Baraka, writes in his forgotten poem, Hegel, of the possibility that we, quote, disrupt each other's lives as history, especially after World War II. The prospects of all-out battle among peoples, the exploitation and destruction of social groups in the name of alleged historical progress is, of course, going to be especially disturbing. But King still wants to hold on to some notion of world historical progress to also justify his hope for forwards movement, also to justify his contradicting his social order, which he thinks can be improved upon. So he can be seen as filling a gap in Hegel insofar as he's convinced where he knows where history is headed and needs to head, and he's convinced that also he knows how to push it there with the help of many others, but non-violently, which seems like it's not going to carry with it the risks of Hegel's indiscriminate perspective. So even if you're skeptical of this kind of progressive conception of world history, you might think, okay, so long as the people who hold that kind of conception of world history and are pushing for what they consider to be progress, if they do it non-violently, it seems like there are not going to be such deep risks as there were in Hegel, where Hegel was, willing to sign off on whatever had to happen. Yeah. Insofar as King finds this kind of middle ground, he can be seen as making a claim to right while also backing it up with power, but a distinct kind of power. He realizes after Hegel, who's himself standing in Spinoza's shadow, that right without power is nothing. Remember, Hegel had emphasized, like Spinoza, the importance of success, even if Hegel had gone beyond Spinoza and also stressing the significance of properly overcoming a prior social order, but also improving upon it. But beyond this realism, King also realizes, standing in the shadow of unthinkable violence in the 20th century and beyond, he realizes something that Hegel had, I think, underestimated, that power without right can be a source of extraordinary evil. That's what's going to lead him to state, I quote, power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. So he thinks power at its best is going to be love implementing the demands of justice. This is what we have to see as we move on. And it's really fascinating to me that Baumgardt, to kind of come full circle here, having studied some of these same thinkers like Spinoza and Hegel, whose Spinozist side he really stressed in his scholarship, Baumgart's going to be thinking very similar things and around the same kind of moment as King. This is an undated aphorism on the left-hand side of the slide from the LBI collection, where Baumgardt explores the significance of aligning right and power. He says, again, in a realist vein, I quote, potential strength is very different from actual one. Even right is only potential might, as long as it's not backed by the willpower of man. So what needs to be done then by Baumgart's lights here, it seems, is that we not only find out where we're in the right, but we also secure power precisely there. King and allies will try to find a way to do something like that in attempting to move things forward without instigating, though, any kind of unnecessary brutality at home or otherwise exporting it, for instance, by any kind of necessarily violent colonial adventures. King and others then avoid contributing supplemental brutality in Montgomery, for instance, where King engaged in that interview I had cited previously, where he's really referencing strongly Hegel, and taking lead of the bus boycott. He'll also pursue these kind of strategies, of course, in many other locations like Birmingham. Here, King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and many others involved in various movements, I think undoubtedly accomplished a great deal, even if not half of what they wanted, and primarily via sit-ins at lunch counters and the like, as on the right-hand side of the slide. King allows himself to be arrested. Here on the left-hand side of the slide, he'll be arrested 30 times almost over the course of his life. So he's finding a way, often with this extraordinary creativity, to stride towards freedom, as he put it, with his kind of teleological outlook, but without intense or even any violence, a possibility that I think Hegel really didn't foresee. And I'm going to pause there. Thanks so much. I hope this has proven to be a historically, but also philosophically interesting story to share today. It's a story that I think demonstrates the sometimes surprising, for me, very exciting twists and turns in the history of philosophy. We've traveled here from the 17th century naturalism of Spinoza's apparently reactionary politics that, though seemingly ends up revolutionary, despite problems that might be left there. We've traveled from him to the 20th century insights of King and also now Baumgardt, but by charting, I think, this necessary course where I've tried to establish, strong links between all of these figures along the way who were reading each other, who were engaging each other explicitly. And I greatly look forward to any thoughts that folks have on King's engagement with Hegel, on a possible gap in Hegel that King can, on my proposal, be understood to try to fill, on Hegel's relation to Spinoza and Maimon, on the relation then between these Jewish and German philosophical traditions, or on anything else. Thank you so much.
Well, so we have about 30 people online, and I just want to encourage you to also submit your questions in the Q&A box if you have any. I'll just turn it on. Hello, hello. There we go. Yeah, thank you. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Jason. If people can hear me online, please
I think they can. Yeah.
submit your questions through the Q&A. And Frank,
How are we going to do this? Who is going to read? Or
I've got the questions on my phone, so.
Well, then maybe you can.
I've got the questions up here too.
Okay. Well, I'll ask one.
Sure.
So the documents that you presented about King's direct engagement with Hegel were really interesting. Mm-hmm. But I wonder, when I think of, from a sort of semi-informed layperson's, non-philosopher's knowledge of Martin Luther King, the not so surprising thing that people often point out, King as a socialist. And I wonder if there's an intermediary there through Marxist thought or even the Frankfurt School to King, as being sort of followers or dialectical reactions to Hegel.
That's a really, really interesting question. It's a question that I want to explore for a follow-up, maybe chapter to a kind of book project here on the origins of Hegel's political thought, but also its legacy. And David, it's an especially interesting question because King will give us some hints there. He reads Marx in the context of the course on the philosophy of history that I mentioned. He studies Marx there at Penn. He's auditing the course there at Penn. In the summer, he says that he then goes to Das Kapital, reads the text. He's engaging further with Marx beyond the confines of the course. He writes to Scott King and he says, Marx was right about at least one thing here, which is that religion can become this kind of tranquilizer. It can become this opium of the masses. He says, I'm going to try to use religion in a way that's not going to fall prey to that kind of Marxist critique. And he's convinced that there is a real risk there, but he thinks that Marx does not do sufficient justice to what we would call today some kind of individual rights, some kind of dignity of the human being as person. And in late sermons, he's going to say really interesting things like maybe Marx, and this is a direct quote, maybe Marx didn't follow Hegel enough. He's speaking, to large gatherings, referencing the history of German philosophy from Hegel to Feuerbach to Marx, and people are cheering him on, like, encouraging him in this kind of back and forth call and response that's characteristic of gospel kind of performance. And it's amazing to hear the story of German philosophy told in that way, in that kind of context. But what he says specifically is that we want the higher synthesis, what he calls higher synthesis, where he's referencing this model that's sometimes used to gloss Hegel's philosophy of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He says we want the higher synthesis that's going to go beyond the thesis of capitalism, the antithesis of communism, and become this higher synthesis. We have to specify what we mean by socialism. I would say he ends up some kind of social democrat with his participation in the Poor People's Campaign late in his life. Also in the March on Washington, sometimes forgotten that the March on Washington was called not just the March on Washington, it was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. It was not just a kind of desegregation movement, but a movement for economic justice, which King thought to be essential to freedom, and which he was campaigning for until the end of his life, apparently with Hegel's philosophy in view. When he says Marx didn't follow Hegel enough, he says, don't pretend like I'm some kind of Marxist. Instead, I'm some kind of Hegelian, and Hegel meets this with his kind of welfare state. We haven't seen the details of that today, but with his kind of welfare state, it seems like Hegel does something that King is attracted to. Yeah, and there's, I think, a lot more to say about this.
Well, thanks so much. Anyone else?
Thank you so much. Thank you for this very interesting lecture. Just a quick question. So according to King, a struggle is not necessary for political progress?
According to King, this is the trick, is that it's an in-between position that he's trying to carve out. Struggle is essential to political progress. He likes that Hegel had shown that. He says that explicitly. But he just thinks that the kind of struggle that we should take up is different from the indiscriminate kinds of struggle that Hegel licenses. Hegel licenses, whatever's got to happen. So remember this slide that I returned to. Hegel is so passionate about this progress in history here that he's willing to license wrongdoing, violence, vice, whatever's got to happen. Justice and virtue are going to get on the slaughter bench. The splendor of individual and national life, the fortune and misfortune of states and individuals can be set aside. Whatever happens, there's got to be world historical progress. And King is like, well, hold on. First of all, if you try to achieve progress by those means, King thinks, you might end up going backwards. You might end up with more unfreedom than freedom. And King also thinks in a more principled way too, that if you try to achieve progress by this means, there's a kind of mismatch between what you're doing and your end. So certain realist philosophers in opposition to King are going to say, you know, the means justifies the end. But King is departing from them here. He says, you can only achieve moral ends at the bottom of the slide through moral means. The means has to be as pure as the end here. So he is narrowing the scope of what's allowed as you try to achieve progress through struggle. But I think he's making a very strong case for it when we look back at what he did and what it seems like he achieved with many, many other peers, of course. He's got a strong case for this. In at least some cases, he's got at least like an important point to make against Hegel, even if only in some cases this kind of nonviolence struggle through nonviolent protest, for instance, can work. Even in that limited set of cases within the larger domain, perhaps, of progressive struggle, this is not something I think that Hegel had anticipated. So he's got, I think, a powerful case that should be considered when it comes to the dialogue here between Hegel and King, where Hegel's got this more indiscriminate perspective. King is trying to narrow the confines of what's going to be allowed here. But, you know, without conceding either by any means.
Hey, I'm curious what theology he was reading during his studies, and whether there was any particular theologian or school of theology that might have influenced his reading of Hegel or influenced him generally.
Good. So yeah, his degree was in systematic theology. It took him a little while to come around to theological study. So when he was a student and when he was visiting that course at Penn, he was tending more in these secular directions. Eventually he did concede and decide he would follow in his father's footsteps to enter the church in this way. But while he's training to enter the church in this way, he's also taking all these philosophy courses, and these things were intertwined. And the big link between them for King was a certain personalist theology, the theology of personalism, where he's definitely going to get influenced in a certain direction then to depart from Hegel. Hegel himself has a kind of personalist God, so he thinks that God has a kind of self-reflexivity in a way that Spinoza's God, for instance, doesn't. For Spinoza, God is one and the same with nature. Spinoza is going to refer, for instance, to God or nature in certain turns of phrase. Hegel has a certain personal conception of God, but he doesn't go as far as King wants him to. So King is going to put this personalist pressure on Hegel, where he's going to say then, for instance, you know, you can't just sacrifice these individual lives in the service of your world historical progress. That's partly why he's trying to slow things down and say, hey, you can only achieve these moral ends through moral means. You can't just put everybody on the slaughter bench of history to the ends that you want. Hegel is more aligned here, I would say, with a range of revolutionary figures like Mussolini. Mussolini thinks blood is what turns the wheels of history. Mao had said the revolution is not going to be a dinner party, where they're saying, you know, there's going to be blood. But King is saying, yes, there has to be a struggle, but it has to be of a certain kind. And insofar as King makes a lot of progress there, and insofar as he's got this personalist theological pressure on him, he doesn't want to say, you know, you can just sacrifice people like that. And insofar as he does make some important progress, I think does challenge not only the US political culture of his day, but also the world more broadly. I think he's got an important case to make. Yeah. I see a couple questions are coming in online too. And maybe I'll read the first one here from Deb Schubeck, who says, were the philosophers who thought people should just be satisfied with their caste in life, were they of a high caste, I take it she means. And that's a very interesting question. Hegel, at the time that he's writing this text that I've been drawing upon, he was certainly in a kind of elite position. The German philosophical culture of his day was really at his fingertips. He was the dominant figure. Schopenhauer is going to complain, for instance, about this. Schopenhauer is teaching at the same time sometimes as Hegel, and all the students are going to Hegel's classes, and Schopenhauer is complaining about that. But I think that that's not the only reason that Hegel comes to that kind of view on which you should try to flourish in your role in society. It's rather that this is like a driving force of his conception of freedom more broadly, where it's not just doing whatever you want. It's something more tied to human flourishing, to expressing your human potential, something like this. And when it comes to King, when it comes to some of these other thinkers, they have different positions. Spinoza certainly was not in the most stable social position, threatened in his day. Some of his friends are certainly persecuted, and Spinoza too rejects any kind of notion of freedom as consisting in free will, doing as you please. So he also thought that you were supposed to reconcile yourself to your necessary position in nature. Hegel's really following up on Spinoza's notion of freedom there. And so I think in Spinoza's case, maybe it's more challenging since it can't just be explained away by reference to Spinoza's elite position in society or something, where it seems like he can say that because he's doing well himself. I mean, Spinoza lived a stable life in the end, but because he avoided and because he was very careful, his motto is caute, which is on his gravestone. His motto was, caution, we have to be careful, but he was certainly at risk of persecution. And insofar as he made that claim that everything that happens necessarily, everything that happens rightfully, is going to be a consequence of that. And that's a consequence of his thought that I did explore. Insofar as he argues those views, I think it's not just a result of his social position, let's say. Yeah. And I see another question from William Magdalene, who asks about the American Civil War as a violation of the principle that only nonviolent means of struggle are justified. Let me specify here that King doesn't think that only nonviolent means of struggle are justified. I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis kind of situation. And I think he thought, speaking to some of the peers of his time, for instance, the Panthers, whom I mentioned then in the case of Huey Newton, I think he thinks that in his time, the best approach is going to be nonviolence, not, for instance, arming a certain Black community, because he thought, first of all, not everyone can take up weapons in that way. It's a necessarily limited political project. And he also just thought that, even if you could arm quite a few people in the Black community with the right kind of weapons, how are you going to, really compete ultimately with militarized U.S. police force and with the U.S. Military more broadly? It seems like King was onto something there. And so I think we shouldn't read his view too strongly to say that only nonviolent means of struggle are justified, but I think we should say King thought that, that had to be the priority, nonviolence, and that could really do a lot. And I think King's example does show us that, at least in some cases, that can do something. In other cases, you might think Hegel's really onto something here, and even if it's disconcerting, the view that he argues, anticipating some of these other revolutionary figures like Mussolini and Mao, whom I cited, you might think he's just telling us a kind of brutal truth about humanity, and in at least some cases, it really is going to work like Hegel thinks, and there is going to be this kind of slaughter bench situation, but maybe not always, King seems to be saying. Yeah.
You want to just maybe take a couple more from online?
Yeah, I see there are several, in fact. Let me gloss over them. Deb Schubeck responds that Spinoza was given this harem. Indeed, yeah, he didn't seem to mind particularly, he was kicked out of his Jewish community, but really accepted that fact. And this relates to what she was asking about, I think, before, concerning the social status of these philosophers and their views. Sometimes you might worry that their views are just a consequence of their social status, where then the arguments are not necessarily as philosophically interesting. David Goldstein asks whether King had displayed any interest in traditional Judaism in his philosophical papers. And indeed, I mean, Mr. Goldstein's question is fair. It's probably coming from a place of reference to what Deb Schubeck here mentions, namely that Spinoza had been kicked out of his Jewish community in Amsterdam. So you might wonder, how Jewish really is Spinoza? I've argued in recent work that Spinoza is deeply engaged with the Jewish philosophical tradition, in particular the Jewish rationalist tradition in the medieval period, figures like Maimonides, who's most canonical, but also Gersonides, Kreskas. And there are, I think, certain Jewish, more orthodox Jewish religious strains in Spinoza. But even if we set Spinoza aside for a moment to respond to Mr. Goldstein's question here, King does seem to be interested too in the Jewish religion as it's practiced in his day. So I didn't mention this, but he's here with Joachim Prinz at the AJC fundraiser in 1963. So he is really engaging there with the Jewish community in some more standard cases, beyond the Jewish philosophical tradition, beyond this relatively controversial figure, of course, Spinoza. And Salomon Maimon is an equally controversial figure. I mentioned he had also been kicked out of the Jewish community. In fact, he was kicked out 3 times, which is a kind of achievement, I guess you can say. And so, yeah, I think there are important connections there between King, between the civil rights movement and the Jewish religious tradition in the 20th century too, not just in the 17th century early modern context or medieval or 18th century context in the case of Maimon. Good. Yeah. Any other questions here?
I think.
Yeah.
Frank.
Yeah, actually, I have a somewhat off the chart question here, but which has, I think, some importance in this context, which is the question, who is the sovereign? And, and to pull out again Kant's position, where basically the sovereign is absolute and there's no way of challenging that. And Hegel is at a moment at which sort of the position of the sovereign changes. And for King, all of this has sort of moved into a totally different realm. And so whether you could reflect on this.
Good. Yeah, the sovereign is this kind of key reference in these political philosophical texts. Kant's going to reference a kind of sovereign as well, who has this ultimate deciding power here, is going to embody the will of the people necessarily, Kant seems to think. But who is the sovereign then in King's day? And I think one very interesting challenge in King that's not referenced as much today as you might like, and of course, there are many kind of manufactured takes on King, so a lot gets left aside. But one thing that does get left aside is not only, King's critique of the white supremacy of his day, but specifically of the white moderate, where there's a deep challenge to this figure who is somewhat sympathetic to the civil rights movement and to some of King's and others' demands, but who isn't willing to go out there and march, who's worried about the kind of conflict that's going to result. That's why it's important that King really does think that struggle is essential to political progress. You might think, okay, we're just going to wait, pass some laws, slowly this would all happen without too much disruption. And King is really saying, no, that's not going to fly. And he's criticizing the white moderate, as he calls them, for that kind of what he considers to be a naive optimism. And I think he might consider them part of a kind of white supremacist sovereign order as well, I think we can say. And I think we can say then that he's challenging them as much as he's challenging the more obvious enemies that he might have in his time. He's got a broader challenge to everybody here.
It's the letter from the prison, and
Yeah.
reflects on all.
Exactly. The letter from Birmingham jail is really fascinating. It's also full of references to the Western philosophical, in particular, tradition, and yet philosophers today have really not sufficiently, I think, taken up this text that references Plato, that references Augustine, that references a bunch of others. In this case, not Hegel, but people are not in academic philosophy today, I think, looking closely enough at these texts, which are so important to the course of world history, as Hegel would gloss it, and which are philosophically interesting really in their own right. So I haven't argued for any particular position, I think, today, but I've tried to explore several, and I've really tried to pitch King as having a potential point to make against Hegel here, following Hegel's deeper and deeper realism that gets him to some dark places as he explores some of Spinoza's political realism, according to which right and power are one and the same. I've tried to show, yeah, King does have some important claims to make here against Hegel. It's not just a kind of story of influence, but it can be a story of dialogue, can be a story of this four-way intersection, as I put it, between Spinoza, Maimon, Hegel, and King, where I think we really need to look more at these texts in dialogue with some of these also more canonical, currently more canonized Western classics like Hegel's political philosophy.
Jason Yonover, thank you so much for joining us here today and this illuminating lecture. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and to those of you who joined us online. So please visit lbi.org to find out what we've got coming up next. Thank you.
Thank you.